Welcome, everybody. Delighted that you are here, and we are going to learn together about an issue that is of urgent concern to all of us, and that is the nature of global anti-Semitism, where it's going, what we can do about it, its current state, and we could not have a better, guest. I don't know if anybody would call Sharon Nazarian a guest at Sinai Temple. Certainly not. She and her family have been almost lifelong members since they first came to the Los Angeles community. And Sharon herself is active in many different areas: academia. She's taught at UCLA. Philanthropy. She heads the Unison and Soraya Nazarian Foundation, and also is and this is of most import, in addition to her academic credentials and her philanthropic credentials and the many different boards like Council of Foreign Relations and others that she sits on. Most important for our purposes this evening is she's the Senior Vice President for International Affairs for the ADL, which is the organization that monitors anti-Semitism both in America and throughout the world. And so, first of all, it's a personal pleasure and honor, and also for all of us, a delight to have Sharon Nazarian with us. And thank you so much. And take it away. Tell us what's going on in the world.
Thank you, Rabbi Wolpe. It is such a pleasure for me to be in my spiritual home. That's where my Sinai Temple is for me and my family since 1979, when we emigrated from Iran to Los Angeles. So, and to have you, I've grown up with you. We've grown up together, I should say. And so for me, it's such a pleasure to be addressing our community together. Where do we start? We start by first looking at the world we're in today, in this very pivotal moment. In the past, we always felt we would say that term and we would say that we're in a pivotal moment. And it really, we didn't know. We had these other historical moments that always seemed more overpowering. But I feel this is indeed a moment. It's a moment in our history that will not just kind of flatten out and become just another year. I like starting by connecting dots and looking at global trends. And so we can start really macro, and then we can come in and zoom in and look at the different parts of the world. The major trends that we're looking at, especially when it comes to anti-Semitism, is first of all, we know that unfortunately trends are going the wrong direction. The main forces that I and my team and ADL looks at are first of all and foremost, looking at political patterns and political waves that we're facing. And I really start with the political growth of populism, of ethno-nationalism, and of political extremism becoming mainstreamed. And this is truly a global trend that no matter which part of the world you look at, and not only from an anti-Semitism perspective, but generally speaking, from, you can look at Brazil with Bolsonaro and what he represented coming in. You can see Europe, obviously, with the rise of right-wing extremist parties who had always been on the fringes and just not allowed to really enter the mainstay of political life coming in, like the AfD in Germany or in Poland, in Austria and other countries. And so you see this rise in populist, ethno-nationalist political movements that are very, very disconcerting. And because of the socioeconomic causes behind it, that people are feeling economically vulnerable, globalization, the impact of globalization, all these factors are making people more susceptible to these kinds of populist ideology. Populist leaders know how to put their finger right on the sensitivities of the masses, and they know how to galvanize that. And I think in some ways, the last administration also knew how to do that. The Trump administration also was very adept at knowing the fears of masses of American citizens and kind of putting the finger on it and making sure that they galvanized, and also using divisive language, using otherism, using the idea of societies being under attack. And that leads me to kind of the second main pattern that we see globally, and that is mass movement of people. globalization, whether it's environmental degradation, whether it's economic issues, has led to populations and mass movement of people. And whenever you have a lot of people moving from one place to another, those people who are on the receiving end of others coming in, this leads to a rise in xenophobia. So the fear of the other coming in. That's what you hear, about white nationalists. You hear about, extreme right-wingers saying that others are coming in, they're diluting our culture, they're diluting our religion, they're taking over our jobs. In fact, that verb was used by the Hungarian foreign minister in a bilateral meeting I had with him, where he actually said that Syrian refugees coming into Hungary are intent on diluting the Judeo-Christian culture of Hungary. And that's why they need to be stopped. So that fear of losing their cultural identity and others coming in. So movement of people leads to anxiety and therefore xenophobia and all the negative things that anti-Semitism obviously is a subset of. And then I would say the third variable, which is very important, that connects all of us around the world, is the role of technology. So with all the positives that technology has brought to our world, we are now also really experiencing the negative side of technology by way of social media companies that are just amplifiers of a lot of ideas that were always there. A lot of negative, hateful ideology that had always existed, but now have a very, very powerful tool to amplify and to really scale and touch millions and millions and maybe billions of lives. So those are the three factors, really, kind of rising political extremism, becoming more mainstream, movement of people leading to xenophobia and all the feelings of anxiety, and the role of technology and social media really amplifying all of that, are the big trends that no matter where you are, who you are, what religion, what faith, you are touched by these three global trends, in my view.
And I just, before we get to the global, because I really want people to see what you shared with me a few moments before before we began, which is the global map of anti-Semitism and how you can track it. I want to go back to what the Hungarian minister said for a second and play, I don't know if it's called devil's advocate or not. I hear very often, and by the way, I just want you to know, people can leave questions on Facebook, on YouTube, on the chat. Please feel free. But I often hear people say, Western Europe in particular, Eastern Europe and Hungary, Western Europe, you go to Paris, it's not the same Paris as it was. That in fact, huge immigration, especially from the Middle East, is changing the culture of Western Europe. And in Eastern Europe, they are afraid that it will change the culture. So it may lead to xenophobia. Does that mean that the concern is not a genuine concern?
Well, I guess it depends how you define democracy and what makes a vibrant democratic society. And if we look at our own country in the US, what we've always upheld as one of the strengths of our society in America has been immigration, right? Especially as Jews, this is something that we've always upheld as the strength of American society and American democracy. Its tolerance, its welcoming of others is based on this historical, always acceptance of immigrants coming in. So then when you talk about Europe today, we have to look inside ourselves and say, okay, if these immigrants, refugees, migrants, wherever they're from, if they didn't happen to be Muslim, or if they didn't happen to be coming from countries that really do hold anti-Semitic views, I mean, we know that data
Right.
is, well, my poll will just show you, I'll share it with you in a moment. If it wasn't that, would we have had the same concerns? So if the concern really is the kinds of views that these migrants or immigrants are holding when they come to Europe, then what do we do about it? Is the answer to close the door and therefore lose your identity as a democratic country or as a country that's always welcomed the other? Do you do that? Do you kind of change that DNA of your identity, of your society? Or do you say, you know what, we're going to keep our doors open, we're going to maintain who we are as a society, and yet we're going to demand, or we're going to ask, and we're going to hope, and also do something about it to educate those who are coming in, to say, first of all, what is our tradition, what is our history, and that tradition and history of not only democratic values, but of tolerance of the other, of respect for the other is something that we will inculcate, educate, and teach about. So it's almost a choice that we can have to make as societies and as governments about who we are, what are our values, and then what do we do about it. So by closing the doors, does that change our identity and the very nature of who we are? And do we really risk, what is the risk reward of leaving our doors open, welcoming the other, but making sure that, yes, we become a more vibrant and diverse society through our diversity and in getting enriched by these cultures that are coming in, like America has gone over time. And also, we're also educating and teaching our values to them, which is one of tolerance. And when it comes to anti-Semitism, for example, why should it not be acceptable to hold anti-Semitic values? And our polling shows that.
So, speaking of your polling, would you give us a brief tour of the horizon of what we know about anti-Semitic attitudes throughout the world and how you track it?
Absolutely, happy to. So, in 2014, ADL conducted the most comprehensive polling on anti-Semitic attitudes ever held. Before that, ADL for 40 years has done polling in the US. And we did it using the same 11 questions that has always been repeated longitudinally to compare over time. And in 2014, excuse me, we made the decision and got a very generous grant to do the most comprehensive global polling that had ever been done in 101 countries. And this is essentially the map of the world. And if I scroll down, you'll see that of the population of the world, we touched about 4 billion. And according to this 2014 data, about 1 billion people in the world harbored anti-Semitic attitudes. And the index score, and I'll explain to you what that is, was about 26%. If you look at the demographics of the polling when it was done in 2014, this is the gender breakdown, the age breakdown, and the religion breakdown. And the basis of the polling are these 11 questions that we always ask. And I'll go through them because I think most of our listeners are familiar with these because either directly or indirectly, we've always heard about these kinds of attitudes. Number one, are Jews more loyal to Israel than the country that they either are citizens of or they live in? Globally, the answer in 2014 was 41% held that view, or they probably felt that's true. Number two, do Jews have too much power in the business world? This is something that I think every single successful, Jewish businessman has heard in his or her life. Number three, Jews have too much power in international financial markets. Number four, Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. Number five, Jews don't care what happens to anyone but their own kind. And these percentages are global percentages from 2014, so keep that in mind. Jews have too much control over global affairs. Jews have too much control over the United States government. Jews think they are better than other people. Jews have too much control over the global media. Jews are responsible for most of the world's wars. And finally, Jews hate Jews because of the way Jews behave. So these are the 11 questions that we've asked over time. And we started in 2014 to ask an international population of 101 countries. And ADL holds that if a respondent answers to more than 6 of these questions in the affirmative, they are believed to hold anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, the beauty of this is that if you want to, and I welcome you to go on the website yourself, it's global100.adl.org, and you can further delineate the questions by some of these follow-up questions, for example, about the Holocaust. Globally speaking, 54% of the world, of 101 countries polled, believe that they have you heard about the Holocaust in Europe during the World War II? 54% had heard of it, 35% had not. The second question we asked about the Holocaust, which of the following statement comes closest to your views about the Holocaust in Europe during World War II? 4% said that the Holocaust is a myth and it did not happen. 28% said the Holocaust happened, but the number of Jews who died, it has been greatly exaggerated by history. And 62% said the Holocaust happened and the number of Jews who died in it have been fairly described by history, and then 7% didn't know. So these are kind of the global numbers. And then what is the beauty of this is then you can go and select the country of your choice in the region of your choice. And you can look at the specific results that were reached in those countries. And you can then also see where, let's go to Europe, for example, where we did 2 follow-up pollings in 2015 and 2019. And you can look at the country, let's say Germany, and you can choose the 2014 original data. You can look at 2015, the follow-up, and then 2019, which is the most recent one. And here you can kind of really dive into the responses from Germany. In Europe, the index score is, I would say, on the lower side at 15%. You have the gender, age, and regional demographic, and then you can really go ahead and see the responses. And it's very interesting to see, for example, this question of dual loyalty. We hear that term oftentimes in our own press. This is an issue that comes up in the US Congress, where we have members of Congress who've been accusing Jews of dual loyalty, being more loyal to Israel than to the US. So that's a very telling number always. That in Germany in 2014, there was a high number, almost 50%. Are we on the 2014? No, we're in 2019. So this is the most recent one. Half of Germans polled thought that German Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to Germany. If you keep going down, which another 42% felt that Jews talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. So this is really interesting for Germany. And you see the backlash of that today. What is the backlash that's coming from this specific question? The rise in right-wing extremist groups. Because what are they saying? Is that, first of all, they're participating in Holocaust distortion, if not denial at least, changing whether the numbers were accurate or not, questioning who was to blame. So this kind of numbers really worries us when we see 42% of German population hold views that they believe Jews talk too much about it and they bring too much attention to it. And that's probably, and then, you'll see this 31% people hate Jews because of the way they behave. So this is a very important tool for us. We're hoping that in 2021 or maybe early 2022, we'll conduct it again. In 2019, the rationale, we didn't do 101 countries again. We did about 19 countries, but we focused it on the countries around the world where the largest Jewish communities lived. So we focused on Europe, we focused in Latin America on Brazil and Argentina, and we focused in Canada, Australia, South Africa, and that's it. So I'm happy to also show you that the other really beautiful part of this is then you could do comparisons. You can put 2 countries side by side. So France is a country that many are worried about and concerned about. So we can look at the most recent polling that we did. And let's see, we can do, let's do Argentina, for example, a country that today is under a great deal of pressure economically and politically, has the largest Jewish community. I think Argentina is the number 6 or 7 largest Jewish community in the world. And the Jewish community today feels the pressures broadly coming from economic challenges, but also then translating into anti-Semitism. So if we look at 2019 side by side with France, a country that a lot of people are really concerned with, because you do see, Rabbi Wolpe, what you were referencing with a large number of Muslim French citizens and large number of migrants. If we look at 2019, so Argentina is on the right, France is on the left. The index score, the total index score of the 11 questions, Argentina holds much higher anti-Semitic attitudes than France does. We go down on these questions, you'll see that Argentinians feel that the Jewish citizens of Argentina are more loyal to Israel. Over 50% of Argentinians versus almost 30% of French Jews, of French citizens believe that Jews have too much power in the business world. 50% in Argentina think that Jews have too much power in the financial markets versus 25%. 60% of Argentinian Jews feel that Jews talk too much about the Holocaust. 30% is quite high also for France, I would say. So this is a very powerful tool upon which we base our understanding at ADL of patterns, of concerns, of directional challenges that we see coming down the pike. And also, what do we do about it then? So this is really data-driven programmatic offerings that ADL and my team specifically think about as we think about the world.
Okay, this is it's terrific to have this information. It's not the results are not terrific, but it's terrific to have the information. And before we dive into it, I want to clear up at least one thing that is going on now on the Facebook feed, which is somebody said, well, the Nazis were socialists, they weren't on the right. That is, of course, not the case at all. Don't be misled by the word socialist. One of the reasons why the communists were their arch enemies was they were on the right, the communists were on the left, and all of their allies, Mussolini, Franco, were all fascists because the Nazis were fascists, just as Nazis today are fascists. So there is anti-Semitism on the left and the right. The Nazis are the anti-Semites on the right. Please don't confuse that. Every political scientist and historian will tell you the same. And I wanted to be clear about that because one of the things, and I'd like you to comment on this, that tends to happen is people only want to talk about the anti-Semitism that is on the opposite political side from where they stand. So if we're on the left, they want to talk about the anti-Semitism on the right. If they're on the right, they want to talk about the anti-Semitism on the left, and how important it is that we touch on both.
I would even go further, Rabbi Wolpe. I would say, can we afford to ignore either?
Yeah.
Do we have the luxury of only looking at, understanding, and therefore trying to push back against only one kind of hate and one kind of anti-Semitism? And I would say we don't. And I would say it's not a left-right, it's about ideologies that are hateful and extremist, and they actually kind of, join, even if they're right and left, they kind of join forces and become a U and become extremists. So if you look at Europe, for example, today, we see a very classic issue around, and maybe most of you don't even think about this, but in Europe today, the idea of circumcision is a very politically volatile question. Mm-hmm. And whether Jews and Muslims, for that matter, have a right to ritual circumcision for their newborn sons. Many Scandinavian countries today, Denmark, Finland, and others, have legislation before their parliaments banning circumcision. Now, it hasn't passed yet. Iceland came very close. But what happens? What are the forces behind this? You see from the right, as we were just discussing, right-wing extremist groups have pushed this kind of legislation because essentially they're targeting Muslims and Jews for that matter. And they don't want non-Christians in their societies. This is their way of pushing out Jews and Muslims, because if you cannot raise your children in the way you would like to according to your faith, you leave. So this is their way. On the extreme left, you have those mixture of extreme left-wing ideologies about, the barbarity of circumcision, about child welfare, even pediatricians who believe this is bad. So it's kind of a coming together coalition of left-wing without really meaning to be extremist in any way. They don't think that they're anti-Semitic. But by the very act of legislation that they're pushing, what they have done today is, and the same goes with kosher slaughter, with shrita, the very fact that they're abolishing the very tenets of Jewish life in any society, that act becomes anti-Semitic because it does not allow for Jewish life to continue in Europe. So today at ADA, one of our real concerns is, what does Jewish life in the future look like in Europe? Is it going to be either secular Jews only, or is it going to be that there will be no formal Jewish community in Europe because of this legislation that will put such undue pressure on Jewish communities that they will emigrate? So this is where the right and the left come together for different ideological reasons, but join hands in a way that will lead to anti-Semitic influences on the Jewish communities in Europe.
So this is a two-part question. The first is basically a yes or no, and then the second takes us to a different part of the world. My understanding, both in America and throughout the world, is there are basically three different, they're not necessarily equal, and they're different, they have different weighted percentages in different parts of the world. But there are basically three different forces driving modern anti-Semitism. One is the far right, the other is the far left, and the last is Muslim anti-Semitism. And I'd be curious to know, especially with the Abraham Accords, what's going on in the Middle East, and how, and has that changed, and could that change, and what are the prospects of, what do you call it, de-anti-Semitizing? Is there a word for that? I don't know. What's that?
Building tolerance and acceptance.
Okay, building, that's much better than de-anti-Semitizing. Building tolerance and acceptance in the Middle East.
Right. So actually, I'm very curious about the next polling that we will do, because my argument is that we should definitely look at Europe, because Europe is always, you know, the region of the world that's of most concern to us, and for good reason. But the second region we will really delve into is the Middle East. And it's because of the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords are historic accords, no matter what anyone tells you, right? Whoever downplays these agreements has an agenda, and it's a political agenda. So I would dismiss them. Today, what has happened after, you know, hundreds of years, but I would say since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, is you have the Middle East changing one of the basic tenets of its political identity, and that is the rejection of Israel, of the existence of the State of Israel. And so in our next polling, and I want to delve in a little bit just so you see, you know, let's look at Jordan, for example, because this is a country that we've had peace, Israel has had peace with, and 2014 is the last polling that we did. That's why we're really due for another one. And I'm so curious to look at what these numbers will look like. So in 2014, 80% almost of Jordanian citizens felt that Jews who live in any other country or citizens of other countries were more loyal to Israel than they are to their own country. Another 79% that Jews have too much power in the business world. So Jordan, I probably would argue that would probably have pretty high numbers still, right? Because we know that both the demographic makeup of Jordan and being almost 50% Palestinian, very politicized population, we know that it won't change too much. But if we go let's go to Dubai, let's go to UAE and see how did UAE fare in 2014? And this will be the real difference that I'll be curious to see. In 2014, the numbers were pretty high. Again, 79% dual loyalty, 74% too much power in the business world. You see the numbers are really high in 2014. So in 21 to end of this year, hopefully, or next year, when we do this, I really want to see what these numbers are going to look like. It'll be early, you know, the Abraham Accords wouldn't really have had much time to kind of infiltrate and kind of filter down to general UAE and Emirati society. But I think it'll be fascinating to see whether these accords will really be a warm peace. That's been the whole question, right? Is it going to be like a cold peace that Egypt and Jordan have had with Israel, or will this be really true warm peace that everyone is hoping for? And we saw that already, just, you know, from the way that the Emiratis, the Bahrainis welcomed this. already feels very different, but the question will really be in the views held by the citizens of these countries, and will they really be accepting of this peace? And it will also impact how they view Jews and their ideas about anti-Semitism.
When one question that was asked both by Robert and Jane Ladenson and also by Bobby on YouTube comes to, when you do these surveys, do you break them down? That is, do you find out in France what ethnicity, what age the person is, what, you know, whether they themselves are immigrants or native? So here you can show us, how you do that.
This is just for UAE that I had up. This is the demographics that we use. You know, we do gender, age, and religion, and then we don't go beyond this. This is showing so all the religions that are present in that society, in that community will be shown. In UAE, it's Muslim. And the only other breakdown, we do have a lot more questions. So in 2019, we had a lot of questions about other minority groups. So what were the views about Africans or about Asians? So we did ask a lot of other questions that I didn't include on here because they weren't measuring anti-Semitism. So we do use other questions as well. But one thing that was very important for us was kind of the Holocaust questions. And again, if we look at UAE, you see that 64% of citizens of UAE in 2014 felt that Holocaust did happen, but the numbers are exaggerated. So this is where we can make a case when we speak with Ambassador Taiba, or we talk with the foreign minister, which ADL does right now, is what role, and we're talking now about solutions, how can an organization like ADL come to UAE and bring some of the education and training that we have offered for decades and decades in the US and around the world. That's what my team does in Europe and in Latin America. How could we utilize the kinds of education that will lead to attitudinal changes? So in the future, when these polls happen, we'll get better numbers. And that's
so
really
I want to ask exactly about that, about what you do. And I wonder if the methods that you use in France have to be in any way essentially different from methods that you would use in Hungary or in UAE, or is there basically a standard curriculum that just works?
No, the curriculum has to be localized, and it has to take the cultural, historical context of each country into consideration, even with countries with the same shared language. For example, Latin America versus Spain, even there we see differences. And we do localize our content because the examples that we use in order for people to identify with the questions, in order for them to be able to have empathy for what we're talking about, have to be examples that they can identify with. So a lot of our educational products are localized, is the term that we use. And the way we talk about the Holocaust in Europe, for example, is different than the way we talk about the Holocaust in the Middle East, because most Middle Easterners, when they talk about the Holocaust, they say, oh, it was a European problem. And they have no knowledge of how the Holocaust did come to the Middle East and was present in their region of the world. And so we have to really, and that's the way to get the empathy. By the way, last week on International Holocaust Remembrance Day, ADL, we did a historic first where we trained all the cadets at the foreign ministry, future ambassadors of the foreign ministry who are now in school to become ambassadors. We trained them for the first time on the Holocaust. We brought a Holocaust survivor. It was the first time they were meeting a Holocaust survivor. And we brought experts who could speak about in both Arabic history and Arabic culture and context, and talking about where Nazism and that ideology manifests itself in the Middle East. And so they had to understand to connect with it and not say it was something that was over there in Europe and we had nothing to do with it.
And do you think because you grew up in Iran, it's something that, especially in the Middle East, which is such a foreign culture to most Americans who were born and raised here, do you think that you find a more receptive audience because you understand the culture better than most of us do?
Well, actually, I referenced that in that first historic training that we offered. I said, as an Iranian, I'm here because the Nazis failed to cross through Russia and get to Iran. I mean, Iranian Jewish historians have found clear directions to the Shah of Iran, who sadly, this was the father of the deposed Shah, who saw himself as an Aryan and sided with the Nazis, clear directions of how to annihilate the Jews of Iran. So by the very fact that there was the winter and that the Russians essentially defeated the Nazis, the Iranian Jewish community survived. So I told them that. And I also said that today, the #1 state sponsor of Holocaust denial and anti-Semitic rhetoric, who is that in the world?
Right.
It is Khamenei, Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran. And I showed them what Holocaust denial looked like. I showed them one of the tweets that Khamenei puts on, regularly, questioning the Holocaust if it happened. We showed them cartoon contests that the Iranian regime holds annually, inviting, artists, political artists from around the world to basically deny the Holocaust. So for me as an Iranian to speak about this to Middle Eastern audiences, I do believe that has relevance to them, because I'm not just a European saying this is something that was a European issue.
I don't know why this is true, but having grown up in the American Jewish community, I heard a great deal about the anti-Semitism of Europe and a great deal about the anti-Semitism in the Middle East, and almost nothing about what happened south of our border. And so, and that's, it's closer, and it's also incredibly important. So would you give us some sense of what's going on in Central, South America, and Latin America?
Latin America is very diverse. Again, as I mentioned, the two largest Jewish communities of Latin America are in Brazil and in Argentina. They have very strong Jewish communities. They're vibrant, and they consider themselves, very lucky to be in those communities. So when I visit them, for example, their federation, their Jewish federations, have a lot of not only the strength of strong Jewish institutions supporting their own communities and taking care of their own. They have a lot of sense of communal work for the broader society, for the poor, for others. So they do a lot of mitzvot, and they're very immersed in their broader cities and the kind of work they do. But what's really fascinating about Latin America is a country like Chile, where most people don't know that Chile has almost 500,000 Palestinian citizens, Palestinian Chileans, who came to Chile, at the turn of the last century, and for most of the time have lived pretty peacefully alongside the Jewish citizens of Chile. But over the last 3 or 4 decades, the Palestinian Chilean community has become very politicized, and the president, who I asked a question from at one of the Council on Foreign Relations meetings that he was invited to, and I was there, he said that we're so saddened that the conflict of the Middle East, the Israel-Palestine conflict, has been immigrated, has been brought into Chile and has become a part of our daily lives. The fact that Chile has such a large Palestinian population, citizenship, means that they are very immersed in the business community, the political community, in the parliament. They have huge numbers, and their politicization now against Israel has become a daily challenge for the Jews of Chile. So what happens in their daily lives? They are held responsible for anything that happens on the Gaza border, anything that happens, in the West Bank. The Jewish community of Chile has to pay for it, has to answer for it. On university campuses, the students are bullied, and they can never show their Zionism or their love for Israel. And so that's a very unique community because of the demographic dynamic that then becomes the engine for BDS and anti-Israel and therefore anti-Semitic views in many cases for the whole region. They export that ideology to other countries. And now you've seen with Venezuela, even with Mexico, with the current president, who have left-leaning views, this merging of left-leaning extremist ideology with anti-Israel stuff comes together and becomes very, very dangerous for the Jewish communities. They are held responsible for a lot of these policies coming out of the Middle East and the conflict. So that's really a burden on the lives of the Jews of Latin America.
I mean, it's a difficult picture that you paint almost everywhere in the world. it seems that there are very few places that are exempt or are free of this difficulty or taint. I wonder if you see some points of light in various places that you might point us to. Are there places that are combating this successfully, or where anti-Semitism has not taken hold that we should look at?
Well, I think, as we mentioned, the Abraham Accord is definitely a point of hope. I think that's where we look forward to the polling and future polling to show that such normalization and peace accords does filter down to the individual citizens. So that's definitely one region that we're hopeful about, and that hopefully will also go beyond those specific countries. It will really kind of ripple out. I think the rest of the world, whether it's Latin America or Africa or Asia or Europe, it comes down to the broader forces that I mentioned, that I began at the beginning, the outset of the patterns that our world is going through. How do we respond to those global challenges? And so that's at the macro level. And then on the micro level, at the grassroots level, how do everyday citizens feel about their own lives and their own communities? So what we just went through in the US, what happened to our Capitol on January 6th with the siege on the Capitol, what has been the reaction of our country to that real assault on our democracy on that day. We are responsible for what happens next to our country. And our country voted, and we had an election, and we have a new administration in, and now we have to hold this administration to make sure that lessons were learned from the extreme ideologies that were mainstreamed in the last few years. The ADL, just today, our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt, testified before a congressional committee of the Homeland Security about domestic terrorism and about what white supremacy, as the way it has grown, the normalization and the acceptance of it in normalized society and political discourse in America and in Europe, for that matter, as well. And then what do we do about that? How do we protect our communities from the QAnon conspiracy theory types of ideology that have become commonplace in our political discourse and our political life?
So that's one of the things that I think is particularly dispiriting, is that it has filtered up to people in government itself, and I think that the trick will be, in such a polarized political climate, can you hold your own accountable? And I assume that that's one of the things all around the world that the ADL pays attention to, is whether people can discipline their own. As in some ways, the Labour Party in England did, right? When they removed Corbyn as a leader, specifically because of anti-Semitism, which is a pretty remarkable. I don't know how much people paid attention to that here, but that was fairly remarkable.
Hope there. I mean, I think that was really, the Labour Party was completely hijacked by extremist left-wing ideology that was anti-Western, that was kind of totalitarian in some ways, that was anti-capitalist, and this strain of extreme left-wing completely taking over a party where most, British and UK Jews, that was their political home, and they were no longer welcome there. So this turnaround and the real wake-up call, with a lot of pain involved, a lot of pain. We saw again polling that showed that British Jews were ready to emigrate in large numbers. They felt so unwelcome, and they felt so unsafe. And to see that turnaround in the Labour Party is a glimmer of hope. And we have to again keep the pressure on Mr. Steimer and his leadership of the party, and making sure that lessons learned are not just swept under the rug. And ADL does do, that's part of my job, is to make sure on every day that we hold them responsible for not going back and doing a U-turn where they were, which was a very dangerous place.
Are there countries that are holding the line? I mean, I think I don't hear that much about Canada, Australia. There must be some countries where the Jewish community feels fairly okay, yes?
Like just today, Canada, I think it was yesterday actually, was the first country to label Proud Boys a domestic terrorist organization. So that's really a very big step. I am emphasizing some of the white supremacy because my team did a report in 2019, and I testified before two congressional subcommittees on the fact that white supremacy is a global movement, just like we understood that Islamic extremism was a global movement. We knew that after 9/11, that this is not just something that is relegated to the Middle East and it won't stay in the Middle East. Once it came to our shores and came to our land, it was a global threat. Today, we say that the same kind of ideas and same emphasis has to be given to global white supremacy, because in that report, we documented not only the mimicking and the copying of white supremacist ideology between Europe and US, but the partnerships, the collaboration, the inspiration they take from one another. We see when they live stream these horrible attacks, whether it was in Pittsburgh or Christchurch or in Halle, Germany, we saw that the next perpetrator would cite the manifesto of the previous perpetrator. And they are using one another's actions, horrific, violent actions, as inspiration for their own violent actions. So for us as a world to come together and say, all right, these things are connected. They're not limited by borders and boundaries. It's not just Europe or just US. They are interconnected, and we have to look at it as a global phenomenon that has to be pushed back again.
So that leads to the question of who should regulate and how should they regulate speech. So what is the ADL's position? Should the government tell Facebook, don't allow this group on? Should Facebook do it voluntarily? Are we comfortable? I mean, both of them seem to me to have problems. On the one hand, you don't want 6 people deciding what can be said on these gigantic platforms. On the other hand, you don't want the government to tell private industry what they can and can't say. So how does the ADL slice that up?
So ADL has been on the forefront of this issue already for a decade. And we were one of the first civil rights organizations who really, for us, First Amendment is one of our, protection of First Amendment is core to ADL's values. Starting in about 5 years ago, where we established our Center for Technology and Society, we're one of the first civil rights organization to have an actual center in Silicon Valley. And at that time, our strategy with the social media company was one of partnership. We said, let's come together. We understand hate. We understand hate online. You understand algorithms. You understand how to connect people. Let's come together, use AI, use machine learning to find better ways to not limit speech, but to take at least as much as possible hate offline as possible. In 2020, we changed that strategy. And for the first time, we went really on the offensive by putting together a coalition campaign by the largest American civil rights organizations, including led by ADL, a campaign called Stop Hate for Profit, where we asked for all the largest business companies in the world, 1,100 wind up participating in this 1 month ad pause. So we asked them for 1 month not to purchase any ads on Facebook, and to show that the bottom line cannot be put above the health of our society. So this was really going at Facebook front and aggressively, and to show them that civil rights community, that the private sector, that all of us will hold them to the standard that they have actually set themselves, which is their own term of use. So getting to your question, where does ADL stand? We see the social media companies, they are private companies. And just like the FDA demands that pharmaceutical and automobile industries have protections for their users. So the caps that we have on our whether it's the caps or the way that our medicine is prepared for us to be safe, or the fact that our cars and automobiles have to have seatbelts and have to have all kinds of protection for the safety of the user, so do social media companies. That is the position of ADL.
So let me jump in right there and ask you about something you said earlier, which is you said in the UAE, you showed them a tweet from Khomeini. Why do they give him that platform? Have you lobbied to get such people off Twitter?
By the way, so before June 6th, the position of ADL was that heads of state need to be heard because their public utterances are vital for their own citizens and for the rest of the world to hold them responsible, right? So that was a very clear position that ADL held. On January 6th, we changed our position. On January 6th, for the first time ever, ADL supported Twitter's banning President Trump from Twitter. We welcome that because we felt that the violence and the incitement that President Trump's language led to, as we saw in the Capitol, and we had seen that coming. I want all of you to know that ADL today labeled the January 6th siege on the Capitol as the most foreseeable attack, domestic terrorist attack on American soil. Everybody, including us, and especially us, because we monitor all of the groups that were there and the individuals who had come who were not affiliated with groups. We had been monitoring them for months and months, and we had shared all that data, all of that information with FBI, with the many state law enforcement, and we knew that was going to happen, and we were very disheartened to see that it was not prevented, and the violence and the death that took place was very disheartening to ADL. So that was the first time that we asked and welcomed Twitter's deplatforming President Trump. And 4 days after that, Twitter also took the step of closing one of Ayatollah Khamenei's Twitter posts, Twitter handles. What they didn't do was he had 7 other in Spanish, in other language, in Arabic, and they did not do the others. So Jonathan Greenblatt, our CEO, wrote a very formal letter welcoming the deplatforming of Khamenei, again, because of the anti-Semitic, Holocaust denying, violence inciting language. And we asked for the other 6 to also be closed off. And so we are in a new world today where, political leaders inciting violence have to now be looked at in a different way than we did, pre-January 6th.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to get to 1 or 2 more questions that people have asked. One asked, what are your thoughts about Antifa?
So Antifa, is not a group that has the makeup of any specific group with a leadership, with an ideology. And when I welcome listeners to go on adl.org and look up exactly our definition and explanation of what Antifa is, it's a loose-fitting amalgamation of people who come together. Some have violent streaks and have caused violence in American cities, but are they individuals? Are they following the beliefs of one ideology or one leader? We don't believe so. We think, again, they're anarchists. They have they hold different diverse views, and many of them are individuals who do that. And I think, again, going back to your point, Rabbi Wolpe, about looking at our own ideological homes, and how do we contend with extremism in our own ideological homes is a very important point that we all have to look into ourselves and say, when will I speak up when extremism and hateful language and hateful behavior is within my own political or ideological home? And that is when we will really move ahead in society. And so Antifa is a boogeyman that is really pointed to. There are violent people who use that label of Antifa who have committed acts of violence, no doubt about it. Does that make any less than the damage that the extreme right-wing supremacists have done in our society? No. We have to be vigilant about violence that comes from anywhere.
I also hear you making a distinction between gangs and international networks, and that those are different both in their potential and in their reach. And so it's a weird inversion of the false conspiracy about Jews that there are actually internationally connected people that wish to do violence against Jews. It's bizarre that actually the conspiracies work in the other direction. And so as to help round this out, how much, I'm going to ask you sort of the classical question. How much of the anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? How much of it is critique of Israel's policies? How do we understand the difference? And then my final question will be, what can we do?
Thank you for that. So the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is one that ADL really strives to make available to our communities so they can distinguish, because that's not an easy one, and I think that's one that really is different from the classic forms of anti-Semitism. When it comes to Israel and criticism of Israel, as you mentioned, we believe that any policy of government, any government, should be, allowed, and any citizen of any country, in fact, has the right and the obligation sometimes to criticize the policies of Israel, as Jews we do, and as non-Jews. Now that line gets crossed when your argument about Israel and the criticism of Israel is the very nature of its existence as a Jewish and democratic state, and a right of self-determination for the Jewish people. So there are very classic red lines that if you cross those, and if you believe that Jews, for example, of all people of the world, do not have a right to their homeland, they don't have a connection, a historical connection to this land, that we do not have a right to self-determination, just like all people do. Those are the lines where, when you cross it, ADL believes that you are now really crossed the line into anti-Semitic speech. And that is not just about criticizing policies that whether the Netanyahu government or any government of Israel holds.
And do you monitor campuses specifically?
Absolutely. So we have 25 regional offices in the US in every major city, and those regional offices really are very connected with the whole communities that they serve, including universities. And we all know that today universities are at the epicenter of real challenges for Jewish students to, number one, show their Zionism, especially in progressive circles where, essentially Jewish students have to check their Zionism at the door, as we say, where progressive activists have very blatantly figured a way to keep Jewish students, even if they don't vocalize their Zionism, to keep them out and to exclude them, whether it's in the vegan club or it's in the LGBT club. Jewish students today do not feel that they're welcome in progressive communities on US campuses. And that's a very, very disconcerting pattern that is not, unfortunately, getting better. What is better on campus is that then Jewish students themselves are feeling emboldened and feeling empowered to stand up, and hopefully with tools such as the IHRA definition today, which is supposed to be a tool of definition, a non-binding tool, a working definition. It's not a perfect definition, but the fact that the examples on the IHRA definition lay out where the picking out of Israel and holding it to a different standard of those examples specifically of anti-Zionism as part of the IHRA definition should help administrators, university administrators, law enforcement, and others to understand when that line is crossed. So the IHRA definition is a lot of controversy around it today. We find that ADL is a very important tool. It's one tool in our toolbox. We have other tools of education, but this is a very important tool that all of us as a society should embrace and make sure that it's utilized properly, that it is not misused. It's not supposed to be punitive. It's not supposed to be codified, but it's supposed to inform, educate, and be able to inform those in power, whether it's administrators at universities or law enforcement. When they see anti-Semitism, they'll know what it is. That's what the examples are supposed to do.
And lastly, what can we do?
So I think, our Sinai Temple community are amazing activists. And whether it's for the support for Israel and all the decade-long missions that you've led yourself, or to Washington, D.C., we have to be vigilant. What I really hope for our community, and I've seen that happen, and you and I, Rabbi Wolpe, have talked about, is the divisions that we've seen across our country also come into our synagogue. Right. And that's some of the healing that we have to do. And that's some of the work we have to do, is to come together. First of all, tolerate each other's differences and political differences, have tolerance for that, have empathy for the other position, not think the worst of the person who disagrees with you, who happens to be a Republican or happens to be a Democrat, and also hold each other to task. We went through a very difficult, divisive few years. We hope that the Biden administration will help all of us heal and also hold all of us to task in being part of that healing process, and also acknowledging what are the lessons learned, what are the danger zones that we came very close to or even crossed as a democracy that we can never let happen again, and we, even in our own Sinai Temple community, have to assure that we don't cross those lines again. So coming together, bringing families, there was so much talk about Thanksgiving dinners being difficult and families were getting together. And of course, COVID didn't help that either. We have to go back to being able to talk to one another and empathizing with one another and knowing that we all want the best for our country. There's just no question about that.
Thank you. A beautiful note on which to end. And thank you so much for your tour around the world and for the education that I think I and everybody else received tonight. And we wish you in your incredibly important work the best of luck.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us.